Velkommen til Sidelinja podcast og en oppsummering av valget i USA.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
I dag med meg Vegard Nøtnes, Arne Eidshagen og spesialgjest Austin Rasmussen, som leder for Republicans Abroad i Norge.
Velkommen til oss, Austin.
Takk.
Veldig hyggelig å ha deg her. Har du lyst til å si noe om din bakgrunn og hva du
Ja, og som sagt, jeg skal ta de fleste på engelsk, fordi når jeg snakker amerikansk politikk, jeg liker å snakke engelsk, så jeg switch over now.
Gjør det, og så prøver vi å holde oss til norsk, så får det heller bare bli rart for de som hører på.
Yes. My name is Austin. As you said, I'm the leader for Republicans Abroad. I've been living in Norway for about 10 years. I'm, as of this year, a Norwegian citizen myself. I came here for love. My wife is Norwegian. We have now 4 very young and great children, or so we think so. And my background, my academic background, my degree is in political science and psychology, statsvitenskap og psykologi. Professionally, I work in IT at the moment, but I used to work for the Republican Party back during the 2012 election. And then in addition to that, I was in the military for 7 years and served in military intelligence. And I was kind of primed for that. Prior to that, I joined the Army when I was 17. Before that, I had left home at 14 to attend a military academy, a boarding school. And so went through that program, which made it very easy to join the Army afterward. But then I met my wife in my freshman year at university while in the Army and as a student, and fell in love and had some important decisions to make, which ultimately led me to your table here.
Ja, og nå har du vært her lenge. Vi kjenner jo hverandre fra før. Vi har sittet i styret i Liberalisten i noen år sammen, og egentlig har vi alle 3 da vært i samme parti i noen år.
Yes.
Så det er ikke helt organisk sånn sett.
No.
Men i dag så det fordi du leder for Republicans Abroad i Norge.
Og da må jeg nesten få lov til, da må jo dette være en god anledning til å si gratulerer med valgutfallet.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very long night, but a very exciting night and satisfying night, obviously. I'm not surprised by the results.
Men det virker som veldig mange ble overrasket. Har du noen kommentarer på akkurat det?
Well, I think a lot of the people who tend to be on screens and carry the title expert, who knows what's really in their minds, but they at least have to feel a little bit ashamed today and what they were telling us. It seems almost as if the industry learned nothing from 2016 and in part 2020 as well. For my own participation in that arena, I kind of broke from my own habit there. In previous elections, I have refrained from committing to any prediction before October. I generally like to wait for the October surprise. The positions I hold, I'm often asked leading up to that point, who do you think's going to win? Who do you think's going to win? And it's too early to tell because between now, whenever I'm being asked, and the election, politically speaking, is an eternity and anything can happen between now and then. But this election was a little bit different for me. I felt a high degree of confidence and certainty going all the way back to at least May, or at least I think that's the first time I was public about my prediction in the media, that a high degree of confidence in a Trump victory. And there were a variety of reasons for that prediction, and I offered that, my reasoning, which I thought was sound, and my analysis, which obviously was accurate. And so I'm satisfied and happy today, but also not surprised.
Så vi snakket så vidt om det før vi gikk på her sånn, at vi her i podcasten har jo egentlig referert til bettingmarkedene, og vi har brukt det der RCP, betting average, som en sånn indikator, og det har vært veldig tydelig ganske lenge nå. Og så har det vært en sånn interessant bevegelse de siste dagene før valget, ikke sant? For da popper det ut meningsmålinger, og eksperter og media, og alle sånn, fy faen, nå går det Kamalas vei. Nå det momentum, og det veldig tydelig retning og sånn. Og så kommer valgnatten, og så det egentlig ganske åpenbart at det var ingenting. Nothing burger.
Absolutely.
Har du noe, det liksom den lærdommen de da ikke klarer å absorbere. Det må jo være det som greia.
Well, the problem with these metrics and relying on them to make predictions is it's easy for us because they have been wrong now consistently. It's easy to try and characterize the people behind the polls, but really they have nothing to gain by being wrong, and so there's no incentive for them to be wrong. So I think it deserves a deeper analysis as to why they are wrong, and I think a lot of that has to do with the bias. And of course, the betting market is I believe, naturally more accurate or gives you a better sense of what's going on because there people have something to lose. They're putting their money where their mouth is, or at least putting their money where they feel they can earn a return. And so I have, I think I got some reactions from some people in the press when I mentioned that, well, what do you think of the polls? I said, I'm not really looking at the polls, but the betting market has Trump favored, in whatever it was at that time. And I would get these confused looks and reactions at, why are you looking at the betting market? And for, I think, a lot of Norwegians, it's a very foreign concept. And so these metrics, one when it was polling, for example, I saw a report recently that found, and don't ask me how they got this number. Sorry. Don't ask me how they got this number, but they found, whatever the number is, I believe it was around 16% of constituents who were most likely to vote for Trump or Republican. It was 16% higher that they would not participate when asked by a pollster how they were voting. Now, why they would participate in a poll and their likelihood of participating in a poll, I don't know. I don't know how they got that number or that figure. But whatever the figure is, statistically speaking, it was significantly higher than the Democrats' willingness, or at least those who are sympathetic to Democrats' willingness to answer these polls, which should have been a wake-up call a long time ago. It's okay, you have these polls, but you're only polling the people who are willing to talk to you. There's at least half of the nation who don't like you and don't trust you. And so how do you think that your analysis or the results, the metrics that you're kind of feeding us here, why should we trust you this time? And obviously, we were right not to.
Og det var jo interessant, nå var jo ikke dette en spesielt god natt for Nate Silver, fordi han trakk modellen sin I løpet av natta og sånn, men han jo en ærlig fyr, så han sier at, vet du hva, modellen min funker ikke, gå til New York Times og den der pila eller et eller annet I stedet. Men det Nate
He's been
Silver,
looking for redemption.
Ja, men det Nate Silver pekte på I dagene før valget var jo at I disse vippestatene så var det statistiske avviket mellom ulike polling agencies var så lite at det var statistisk umulig at de ikke så på hverandre.
Ja.
Ikke sant? Og det jo noe med den der troverdigheten som de reddere for å ta feil alene enn å ta feil kollektivt.
Ja.
Og det virker som journalister også der.
There are some pollsters who got it right, and there were some analysis of the polls that here in our lovely Norway, for example, there's I don't know, I think his title is technically media critic. His name is George Gooding. Yeah. And I read a report that he published yesterday, and he had a very incisive breakdown of what was going on in the polls, which led him to his conclusion, which was also correct. But it's not often that we see that kind of analysis. It's not often that we see an analysis that's void of emotion, and that's what's important. But if you're going to have the emotion involved in trying to pan this out, then you have to see it holistically. You have to look at the big picture. And what was problematic, I think, a lot there were some reports that came out as early as this spring, namely from the Media Research Center, but others as well, that found, on average, the media coverage of Kamala Harris, she wasn't the candidate in the spring, but Biden at the time, and then Harris. On average, the coverage of the Democrat candidate was between 85 and 90% positive. However they quantify that, I'm not entirely sure, but however they do it, the results came out 85 to 90% positive for the Democrat candidate. On the other side, it was 85 to 90% negative coverage of Donald Trump. And it was really interesting to just see the very abrupt heel turn that the media industry took when Kamala Harris, I say when she was coronated as the candidate, because she wasn't elected by her party. But when she was given that position and they removed Biden, there was an instantaneous heel turn in these institutions that are faithful to the Democrat Party. And in itself, that kind of heel turn is so condescending to the normal person who isn't consumed with politics like some of us are every day, all the time, or aren't news junkies like some of us are. whose only connection to politics are the pain points in their day-to-day lives and any kind of sensational headlines they might catch in between paying bills and taking care of children and working and whatever else. And so a lot of these people realize over time when they see the consistency in it that they're being lied to, or at least being duped somehow. We were supposed to believe when Kamala Harris, it's almost as if the media wanted us to believe when Kamala Harris became the candidate that time itself began with her candidacy, that we would forget everything that preceded her candidacy. For example, not 1 or 2 months before she took that position, senior Democrat strategists were openly talking in editorials and on the screen about how Kamala Harris is a liability for the Democrat Party and how she would be a liability for a second run for a Biden campaign. And then a lot of the roots of that concern, rightful concern, we can go all the way back to the 2020 election when Kamala Harris ran against Biden and over 20 other candidates for president at that time. It was a big field. And amongst that big field, Kamala Harris was in the lowest rung. She was the least popular. She couldn't, even in her own home state of California, garner more than single-digit percentage in support. So she has consistently been one of the least popular politicians in America, in the contemporary American political landscape. And how none of that was taken into account by those that are supposed to report the news to us, how none of that was taken into account in calculating the atmosphere and whichever way the wind is blowing, politically speaking, is the surprise of this election. Not Trump's victory, but the absolute failure of these institutions.
Det veldig rart, altså. Og den liksom det som burde ligge helt på overflaten for norske journalister også, da, selv om de ikke liksom sånn supereksperter på amerikansk politikk, så det den helt åpenbare, dette et sånt eksistensielt valg, det viktigste valget noensinne, ikke sant? Hvert valg jo det. Også,
every election in my lifetime.
Ja, ikke sant? Men de kommer altså trekkende med en mann på 82 som knapt kan gjøre rede for seg, og blir 86 før presidentperioden ute. Og så dropper de han, og så prøver de med et straight face å si at dette valget fortsatt viktig. Og så kommer du bare trekkende med Kamala Harris, som en sånn empty vessel, omtrent.
Even when that switch was made, as far as polls go, Biden still had a significant lead over Harris in popularity, taking them as individual politicians. She was still more popular. He was still more popular than she was. It was a bizarre development, but it was also a development that many of us in the Republican Party anticipated 4 years ago, that Kamala Harris would be after that job. And we knew then that Biden was already well on the path to cognitive decline. And Kamala Harris was in the wings to inherit what he had. And it wasn't going to work. It just could not work as Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris was not picked because she was a qualified candidate. She was not picked because she's politically savvy. She was not picked for anything that you would generally pick a vice presidential candidate for. She was picked because she satisfied the progressive politics of the Democrat Party, this wing of the party that has been running their party into the ground, this identity politicking. And I think this victory for Trump puts the Democrat Party in a position where they're going to have to do some real soul searching. They're going to have to do a deep dive inward and figure out what's going on. And I don't think, unless they're willing to distance themselves from that identity politicking, I think they're going to see a lot more results like they are seeing today. So that's where we are.
Jeg tenker Austin, jeg la merke til at du nevnte George Gooding, og han har en artikkel ute i Subjekt i dette nu, og der går han vel gjennom Snoens bok hvor han diskuterer hvorvidt Trump fascist. Og jeg tenker, dette jo en veldig aggressiv ordbruk, og som kanskje også i og for seg har vært, altså det begreper som også har vært brukt i amerikansk debatt, men hvordan kommer vi dit, og hvordan føler du i forhold til den typen retorikk?
Unfortunately, I think it's indicative of where we are as a culture, that we're always going for these top shelf words to make a point. I characterize Norwegian media coverage of American politics specifically more as being something that's a production of reality TV more than it is reporting the news. And so that is part and parcel using terminology like this, fascist, the comparisons to Hitler. The Norwegian media industry has has adored kind of the Democrat Party and what we characterize as leftists in America for a very long time. And I think so long that they don't even remember what it was like not to adore that side of the politics. But what ultimately happens in that regard then is when they're presenting the picture of American politics, it's less than half of the picture. So Norwegians who consume this content, and especially those who consume only Norwegian content, are not getting a full picture analysis. They're not getting a holistic view of what's developing in the United States, politically speaking. And that what that leaves is a lot of misinformed and people ignorant of that topic, of course. When it comes to how this content is produced, a lot of it is to capitalize on engagement, profitable engagement, to get clicks, of course. But I think there's an element of narrative control here as well, and making sure that Norwegians continue to agree, because they all go in on one premise, whether they're an expert, and I use quotation marks when I say that, or whether they go in as a host of a show. But it's always on the premise, Democrats good, Republicans bad. And that's the starting point. And once you have that as a starting point, you've already lost all credibility as any kind of journalist. You're now akin to a teenage blogger more than you are a journalist. It's a very almost adolescent and immature way of reporting this information. You may have personal views, but that shouldn't infect. This is your job. This is what we expect you to do. And I was at NRK this morning and having conversation with some of the producers there and some of the other people that were slotted to be on. And I told them, I said, I long for a day that was before my time. Where we had these journalists that spoke truth to power and not spoke to power, and that reported the news that they were ambitious to report was the news nobody wanted to read, or someone didn't want them to publish.
Det som kostar litt.
Yes, you have skin in the game, and it has real substantive content and value to society and to your audience. That I don't see any semblance of that anywhere. Of course, with exceptions, George Gooding, I hold him in high regard, and I have a respect for him. In fact, George Gooding, because he is as competent as he is in what he does, is this media critic, and he's much better at navigating this system as I do. I gave him full makt to represent Republicans Abroad against PFU, or not against, but in the PFU system when we have those experiences that we're being either underreported or intentionally misinformed on who Republicans are and what. There's an imbalance anyway.
Men jeg lurer litt på også denne demoniseringen av Trump og det republikanske partiet som kontra, hvordan man trykker demokratene til sitt hjerte. Altså, hvor stor forskjell rent politisk føler du at det mellom de to store partiene i statene?
To be honest with you, after the election is over and the campaign is over, there's not a lot of differences between the parties in their day-to-day functions. The problem is in the United States, so much of our government is controlled by lobby organizations. And there's too much cronyism in politics for a president to really be able to do anything radical. And besides that, I mean, you have a lot of this fear-mongering about Trump. He's going to be a dictator. He's going to be a fascist. He's going to be able to. But quite frankly, in American politics, if you just take Civics 101 and you would understand there is no mechanism for Trump to be any of those things as president. There's simply no mechanism in the American structure for him to be any of those things. Anyone claiming otherwise has no clue what they're talking about, despite having the title USA expert on NRK. So on the one hand, there's no mechanism. And the reason Trump appeals to so many Americans is because he is an outsider. He does challenge that status quo. And a lot of people don't really care how he does it. They just want it done. And I don't think he did as good of a job in doing that in his first term, but I'm hoping he learned something from that experience and does better in the second term. And now in this term, he doesn't have to worry about re-election. It's gloves off, and the prospect of bringing Elon Musk with Ron Paul as a consultant to get federal spending. And so, but to answer your question, the differences between the two parties, we do have a uniparty problem in the United States, much like we have here in Norway. There's there's a lot more in our politics between Norway and America that we share in common than a lot of Norwegians think.
Det blir litt som når vi snakker om de store partiene I Norge som Stortingspartiet, ikke sant?
Yes. Yeah, of course, as we all know, them pulling the ladder up and shutting other party competition out. But not just that, the uniparty problem. In Norway, for example, there's a general consensus on the philosophy of how the government runs. Right? There's no debate on the philosophy of taxation. It's just how much are you going to pay?
Yeah.
And so when you have that kind of uniparty problem, in Norway, there's a little bit more of allowance for micro-parties to prop up to compete with those bigger parties. But even amongst those micro-parties, they themselves aren't really parties. They are what we would call in America an interest group. They're not designed, they don't have a platform to be in a political leadership position. They have a platform to address the environment or feminism or religion or whatever. But give them the keys to the country tomorrow and they'd be lost.
Jeg tror jo det som kanskje spesielt norske journalister har en tendens til å undervurdere, det jeg også kjenner jeg kan føle på, for jeg jo ikke Trump-tilhenger som sådan. Det litt som pest og kolera for meg. Men jeg merker jo at jeg liker den langefingeren Trump Ikke sant? Det en sånn beskjed til det etablerte om at dette finner vi oss ikke I lenger. Og så det I min bok litt sånn feil fyr å velge til det. Men Gud hjelpe, det litt sånn tilfredsstillende likevel. Og det jo jeg har jo tenkt at det jeg håpet skulle skje I natt, var at jeg bryr meg ikke så veldig om hvem som vinner presidentvalget, men jeg håper at det blir motsatt parti som vinner kongressen, bare for å få lagt down hele greia.
I always get a reaction out of the media because when I make a similar point, because as far as the general narrative goes is that democracy is important and the government always needs to be working. And anyone who stands in the way of that stands in the way of democracy, which of course I fundamentally disagree with. When I am asked about the results and how I feel about them, or when we're waiting on them, if Trump wins, but Democrats take Congress, for example, or vice versa, how do you feel about that? And my answer to that is, well, if we're not electing an administration that's coming in with the priority of lowering taxes and deregulating, then the next best thing for me is a gridlocked government. If it was some Republican who was a war hawk and was not prioritizing those values that are important to me, then I would vote for a Democrat congressman to get into office to keep that gridlock in place. So I agree with that sentiment. I have come around a bit more to Trump I was speaking at Stortinget earlier this year, and I got a bit of reaction out of the audience because I explained that I had voted for Trump 2 times before, and this will be my 3rd time voting for him in this election. And what's different now is I will be doing so with a much higher degree of enthusiasm than I did in the previous 2 elections. When I first voted for Trump in 2016, it was definitely with reluctance. I did not know what to expect from him or what kind of politician he would be. And I did not vote for him in the primary election. I voted for Rand Paul. I'm in the Liberty Caucus of the Republican Party. And that wasn't anything personal against Trump. It's just that Rand Paul aligns more with my position in philosophy. But now we stand here, and I like the description of him being that long finger, pointing. And I look forward to seeing what he does with that, and I hope he takes the lessons that he's learned from the first term and better. But again, as I said before, for many Americans, this was it. This was all they wanted, was this victory, because he challenges that status quo, and no matter what he does, it's going to shake up the institutions and establishment that run the federal government.
Ja, her I Norge så kom det vel nærmest en sjokkerende liten meningsmåling blant unge menn om at nærmere halvparten støttet Trump, og det kom som et sjokk for mange kommentatorer.
Rett nok statistisk ikke veldig signifikant, men det skapte litt bølger.
But it's indicative of, I think, a fading narrative. I have observed that in the media, especially this campaign cycle, there's a lot more contempt and vitriol in mainstream publications for not just Trump, but Republicans in general. But I've also observed a development in Norway over the last 8 years, from 8 years, from 2016. Back then, it was really taboo to say anything positive about Trump. It was for many people considered it social suicide to say that you could even dream of supporting Trump. To see where we are now compared to them, there are a lot more Norwegians who are openly supportive of Trump and sympathetic to Republicans and their cause, and they're not as afraid or worried about talking about it. If you go to pretty much any Norwegian newspaper on social media, and if they've published an article about Trump or Harris and look in the comments section, you can get a temperature, or you can get an idea of how a lot of Now, of course, that's in a bubble on social media, but you get some sense. And this poll is another one of those metrics to show that once you lose that much of that generation, your narrative doesn't have much of a future at that point.
Det var litt morsomt, jeg så den der fantastiske faktasjekk-sida faktisk.no. Fordi de er jo ganske selektive på hva de faktasjekker, og de hadde jo, fordi de hadde en sånn Trump-sak, ikke sant, så hadde de faktasjekket Marjorie Taylor Greene, og hun hadde sagt at demokratene kontrollerte været. Det kunne de fortelle at det var ikke sant.
No.
Det er liksom...
It's the same. One more relevant to Norwegians is even just this morning when I was sitting in the Green Movement at NRK watching their network, it was coming on. They were showing that and reporting that Trump threatened to remove the United States from NATO. But he never made that threat. He never said that that's what he was going to do. He challenged NATO. He challenged the efficacy of NATO, and he challenged the financing of NATO. And since he's done that, what has happened? What has developed? Almost every NATO ally has ponied up and paid their bills, and a lot of the leaders of those nations have reluctantly admitted, hey, Trump was right. We should not have been relying on blue-collar Americans to pay for our defense.
Eller olje og gass fra Russland i nye ledninger, og alt det der sånn, som ble fullstendig latterliggjort på tidspunktet. At dette er bare Trump som roter, liksom, for så flaut. Og så er det bare, svært presist.
Yes.
Men jeg tenker, det er kanskje ikke bare media som er et problem i forhold til å ha en rimelig fremstilling av Trump spesifikt. Du ble intervjuet i Subjekt om hvordan Trump blir fremstilt i norsk skole, stemmer ikke det, Austin? Kan du fortelle litt om det?
Yeah, I was contacted by a journalist at Subject recently, explaining that they had been anonymously given some source material from their classroom, but that source wanted to remain anonymous, and they were they wanted to know if I was willing to discuss the content and the implications of it. And of course I was willing. I have no problem. It's no secret where I stand in all of this. And I was surprised. Now there was it was a kind of a bigger packet, and I read I read through all of it, but in reading the introduction to the lesson, I thought it was somewhat fair. The first, it was a very kind of generalized description of the Republican Party and a little bit of its history, and the same for Democrats. I probably would have added a few things, but generally speaking, for that level of student, it was fair enough. But then continuing on after that point is where it all kind of fell apart. You had this really bizarre and fictitious interview that was generated by AI, by ChatGPT, of Trump and how he might respond. And of course, I would presume that it's the teachers in charge of this lesson that are writing or crafting the prompts for that interview. And there was just enough points in that so-called interview to for a young developing mind to maybe say, oh, this is believable, But there were a lot of things in there too that Trump has never said. It's a ridiculous exaggeration of even taking, Trump. One difference in his mentality this campaign cycle versus the past is he somehow, and right and good for him for doing it because it was necessary, but he found some way to speak with warmth. He's had more warmth this election cycle than previous, and in that warmth comes a bit of a comedic element as well, where the guy can talk at his rallies, and he can be a bit of a comedian off the cuff. He's really talented in that way, and he didn't really have that. He kind of comes off to a lot of people as this stern kind of grandpa figure, and he's done a good job selling it. But this interview would take even things that he said in jest, off the cuff, that no one in any social setting would take seriously, and then plugged it into the interview as if this is a policy statement. A great comparison, because this just happened last night. I was at Valgnatten for Drammens-Tidende, and I was there with some other. There was a political scientist there. There was another dual citizen American there, and then they also had Hans Hög, there to speak, and he wasn't there in person, he's in Washington, D.C., but there to speak remotely. And Hans Høeg is chief of staff, I believe, is his position for Thomas Massie. And I was really excited to see him and speak and all that because, as we all know, that's my caucus of the party. And the host of the event, of the Valgvaka, was the politisk redaktør of Drammens Tidende, and she was the one queuing the questions for Hans Høeg to push the conversation along. And he wasn't really giving her what she wanted, I don't think. One of the points he made, for example, is that these presidential elections are really not as consequential and important as we pretend they are. We kind of make a sporting event out of it. Then she decided to reference, and when asked who he voted for, he said, well, I don't really care for Trump, so I didn't vote for him, and I definitely couldn't vote for Harris. But so what I did was I wrote Thomas Massie on my ballot and voted for him for president. At the end of this segment, the politisk redaktør then asked him, he said, there's this Margaret Atwood who likes to talk about political developments, and she has these concerns, maybe not so much about Trump, but about J.D. Vance. What do you think about that? And he kind of snickered. I was like, well, I guess that's one view of things, but I really don't share those concerns. And I'm sitting there aghast that she thought, for context, Margaret Atwood is the author of A Handmaid's Tale. Her field is not politics, it's quite literally dystopian fiction. And why the politisk redaktør of a fairly large newspaper would think this is a relevant question or viewpoint at all, I think a better question would be, you voted for Thomas Massie for president. What do you think about Thomas Massie endorsing President Trump for president last week? That would have been more relevant, I think, to the situation, but it wasn't. But this is part and parcel of how these things unfold. And when it comes to this interview, the AI interview, it was a lot of that kind of non sequitur, irrelevant topics and narratives to what Trump is actually running for. And then continuing further in the lesson material, you come across these posters, election posters, and Kamala Harris on one side and Donald Trump on the other. And Kamala Harris, and the characterization of her was, she's kind, she's sweet, she cares about everybody. It's just really big pie in the sky kind of stuff. And then under her name, they put all of the celebrity endorsements that she has, Taylor Swift and the old classic rock bands and all this. And then under Trump, it was Elon Musk and Trump. And he's a fascist. And Hitler endorses him too.
Uff, det er en fryktelig forsøpling av et hvert ordskift, og særlig når du presenterer dette for barn, så er det fryktelige saker, ikke sant?
This kind of education, or this kind of approach, this approach to education is actually one of the hottest topics in America right now, and actually hasn't been talked about a lot in analyzing this election, is the topic of school choice. That is a serious issue. Arizona, for example, is one of the pioneer states when it comes to this, where parents are getting fed up with teachers and education professionals and how they are teaching or educating their children, or lack thereof. And in Norway, there isn't really that movement. There isn't that similar movement. But I'm a parent of 4 children here. One of them is just this year of school age. And my wife and I have discussed this obviously quite deeply. And as long as I can afford it, as long as my circumstances permit, I could not in good conscience send my child to a public school in Norway, or the United States for that matter. But I live here in Norway. I could not do that to my child. Now, of course, in Norway, there is no such thing as a real private school. But there are varied degrees of that, and that's where we choose to send our child. And if I were a parent of a child in this school with this kind of material, it doesn't matter what the orientation is. They could have called Trump Hitler, but they could have just as easily called a Democrat some other evil name and promoted my side. It doesn't matter what the orientation is of the teachers. It's the principle of the matter. I would be very, very concerned about having a child, because this pedagogical approach is rarely, if ever, limited to one day in class. This extends to everything this teacher does, and I would want a serious review of their qualifications. I would want a serious review of the curriculum they have in place, and what the rest of the year is going to look like for my children.
Det er jo fristende å si, ikke sant? For nå er vi inne på indoktrineringen av barn. Men den er jo for voksne også.
Ja.
Vi hadde en sånn artikkel i VG her om dagen. Anders Giæver skrev om Trumps uttalelse om at han skulle henrette Liz Cheney. Vi kan spille av det klippet.
She always wanted to go to war with people. I don't want to go to war. She wanted to stay in Syria. I took them out. She wanted to stay in Iraq. I took them out. I mean, if it were up to her, we'd be in 50 different countries. I don't blame him for sticking with his daughter, but his daughter is a very dumb individual, very dumb. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. You know, they're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy. But she's a stupid person. And I'd have meetings with a lot of people, and she always wanted to go to war with people.
Ja, der hørte vi hva Trump sa, og så gjengir Anders Giæver dette i VG og kan fortelle at Trump vil plassere henne foran en mur og henrette henne uten videre. Det jo samme indoktrineringen om du vil.
It makes me think of 2 things that happened after that, or around that, when he made that statement. One, I think Subject actually had a very good characterization of this. Do Norwegian media personalities understand English well enough to be able to report on American politics? That is a very good question. It may be in jest or rhetorical, but I think it's something that should be taken very seriously.
Ja, fordi det enten at de ikke forstår engelsk, eller at de lyver. Det ikke noen mellomting her, sånn.
Exactly. It's one or the other. And the other thing it reminds me of is actually Jon Stewart, of all people. Jon Stewart had a clip. Now, he's not sympathetic to Trump at all. In fact, does not like Trump at all, is openly supportive of the Democrat Party. But he had this clip that he did on his show recently around that time when I think it's actually what preceded this statement was when Kamala Harris was sitting on a stage with Liz Cheney, as if Liz Cheney was somehow supposed to move the needle for Kamala Harris. And Jon Stewart's characterization or analysis of this, because he showed that and he juxtapositioned it next to Trump going to a barbershop in the Bronx and going to work at McDonald's for a shift. You know, these types of things. He said, what is going on? The politics in America has turned inside out. You have the Republican going to the Bronx and working at McDonald's and the Democrat having a book club with the Cheney family? So what's going on here? And of course, the point he's making in that statement is not that he wants to execute or to see Liz Cheney die. It's the fact that we all remember that in the Bush administration, the Cheney, I don't know if you call it a dynasty, but the cartel or whatever, that family was instrumental in getting us involved in a 20-year conflict in the Middle East that had zero net positive in any way. I mentioned earlier, I was in the Army for 7 years. I never served in combat, but in my tenure in intelligence and in the Army, I buried a lot of people in that time. I had an extra job on the Honor Guard, which was secondary to my primary job, but it was something you did because it was an honorable thing to do or the right thing to do. And in that period, I buried a lot of people who died in that conflict. And when I speak to friends who fought not just once, but twice, some of them 3-4 times, I have yet to meet one who says we did something meaningful over there today. You know, back in that time when the Cheneys were running this, they were propagandizing us in that period to make us believe that we were over there fighting for freedom and that we were avenging those lost in September 11th and all that. Of course, all of that came out to be lies. And Liz Cheney was, by the grace of her constituents, given an opportunity to reinvent the family name of Cheney, and she failed that. And she turned her back on the party, she turned her back on her constituents, and she did it out of political expediency. She thought because the way the winds were unpredictable at that time, if she stuck the knife in the back of Donald Trump, that she might get some political capital out of it. And that didn't turn out that way. So now she's in a position, not only did she fail to reinvent the Cheney name, and this is where a Democrat political strategist kind of got it wrong, is that now they're in a position, nobody likes the Cheneys. They are a family with no political home. Your average Democrat will remember that time and will remember what the name Cheney is associated with, and in no way is she going to move the needle for Democrats. And Republicans, who have over the last 20 years become the anti-war party, those neocon war hawks that were in the Bush administration and in that era of Republicans, have found a very comfortable new home in the Democrat Party. They are no longer welcome amongst Republicans. And so there has been a shift in branding, there has been a shift in will, and there's been a shift in perspective. And so now being in that position, only the media industry and only the elites in the political establishment would think to reference Liz Cheney as if it's a positive for moving the needle in politics. Only these two establishments would look, but wait, we have Liz Cheney. Doesn't that convince you? And they have to be, that, which just shows you they are in no way connected to real people. They are no way have their finger on the pulse of American politics.
Tror du at din side har hatt motsatt effekt av å få Tulsi Gabbard og RFK og kunne risikere å få enda flere av disse fredsduene fra demokratene som nå har kommet over til deres side?
Policy-wise, just taking someone like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, there's not a lot I could agree with her on. But the thing is I when she ran for president, I was asked as a kind of experiment question by someone in the media. They say, okay, if you had to vote for a Democrat and not Donald Trump, who would you vote for? In that time, Tulsi Gabbard was in the field, and I said I would vote for Tulsi Gabbard. In fact, at that time, I thought, honestly, that Tulsi Gabbard, of all candidates, both Democrat and Republican, may have been the only one who had any potential of actually diffusing the polarization in the United States. Realistically, putting policy aside and philosophy aside, putting all that aside, I thought she had real potential for doing that. And so I said I could have lived with that. And second to her, I would choose Joe Biden. And the reason for that is because he's in cognitive decline, and I think we'd be looking at a pretty lame duck presidency. But I think it's a pro-benefit for the party that Kamala Harris has come over. I think it's a pro-benefit that RFK has come over. And it is not at all the same as Liz Cheney going over to the Democrat side. The difference is people like Kamala Harris and RFK can move the needle. They have their own constituency. They have a sect of people who do believe in them, who do support them, and are very passionate about what they have to say. So I hope Trump is clever enough to include people like both Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, Elon Musk, Ron Paul, that he gets this kind of diverse cabinet together with people who are very intelligent and highly skilled in their respective fields. And that to me, and to get different perspectives, quite frankly, because I might not agree with Tulsi Gabbard, but she does represent a lot of people in that country, and getting that perspective involved is important. And if not for anything other than to diffuse that polarization.
Og om ikke annet så de anstendige mennesker, og det betyr noe det også. Du, Austin, vi kan ikke slippe deg før vi stiller noen kritiske spørsmål også.
Mm-hmm. Det sant, det klart med, hva skal vi si, med de snakkende klasser I Norge om dagen, så det jo en del bekymring med tanke på altså en ny Trump-presidency. Så Christina Pletten I Aftenposten I dag, hun kommer trekkende med en del punkter som bekymrer henne og Aftenposten. Og dette en del løfter da, fra Trump, hvor han skal ha sagt det at han ønsker å straffe sine politiske fiender. Det noe du har en kommentar på?
I think that's major projection there, to be honest with you. When it comes to Trump winning this election, this victory, there's no other way to characterize it as the single biggest political comeback in American history. And when I say comeback, I mean he has come back. We're in landslide territory now. It looks like he's also going to get the popular vote. He's getting both houses of Congress. All of that after 2 impeachments, after 2 assassination attempts, after all of the coverage that he gets in the media, and then after what's relevant to this, the weaponization of America's justice system to go after opposition to power. And so they may fear this. I hope Trump instructs whoever he has in charge of the Justice Department to pursue criminals, to pursue anyone who has broken the law and investigate and go into that endeavor with the old American traditional premise that everyone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law by a jury of their peers. I am not concerned. I think Trump has too much to do and too much on his plate to weaponize the justice system in the way that the Democrats have, in many ways, put the United States on the brink of becoming a banana republic. But that is a Democrat tactic. That's not something we've seen yet from Republicans.
Neste bekymring det at Trump har sagt at han vil gi RFK kontroll over helse og forskning. Og RFK vel egentlig kjent mest I Norge som vaksinemotstander, men hva din kommentar?
I have no issue with giving him a chance. There's a lot of things that RFK says when it comes to health policy that I agree with personally. I'm not particularly keen on his position on firearms, for example. I'm not particularly keen on a lot of his economic positions. But Trump is talking about putting him in charge of health. And as long as he can stay in his lane, then there's a lot that RFK brings to the table that speaks to me as a Republican voter.
Flott. Tredje innsigelse la Elon Musk svinge øksen over statsbudsjettet.
Bring it on. I can't wait. I hope that that's true.
Viva la libertad, carajo!
I love that. Afuera! Afuera!
Flotte greier. Men hva skal jeg si, fra et mer sånn liberalistisk ståsted, så kanskje neste punkt viktigere. Altså, Trump har jo lovt eller truet med å innføre enorme tollsatser på all import. Det noe du har noen tro på?
As far as tariffs go, principally speaking, I don't like the idea of tariffs. I just don't. And it's one of the weaknesses, I think, in Trump's platform. One of the weaker planks of his platform is this tariff idea he has. That being said, I understand what he's thinking. I understand why he's inclined to go that way. I hope that if he does pursue tariffs, he does so in a way that it's compensatory. And what I mean by that is if he implements tariffs, then at least the American people should be paying less in taxes, and inflation is then somehow managed in monetary policy. But that the bottom line is a net positive for Americans. If it's tariffs in place in addition to everything Americans have to contend with at the moment, especially all of that leading to a much higher cost of living, then we have a problem. And then I would myself be seriously critical of Trump, even in the position I hold at the moment. Principally, I don't like it. I'm skeptical of it. I don't have a lot of faith in the success of tariffs and what he's trying to do with them. So I would agree with criticisms there. It's really hard for me to do anything or say anything else to defend that, because it is as you say, anti-liberalist to organize the market in that way.
For at jeg tror vi hopper til siste, fordi det har fått en god del oppmerksomhet, og det Trump har lovet å kutte støtten til Ukraina, og det kanskje, hva skal jeg si, nå har han vel også lovet å skape fred I Ukraina. Men
I dag faktisk,
I dag,
det skulle skje så snart han ble valgt, så skal han ringe Putin. Så.
When it comes to Ukraine, if him and Congress work together and come up with, and their conclusion is the support needs to stop, then I'm fine with that. Not because I don't sympathize with the Ukrainian people, but because we have been testing this idea of sending an endless amount of funds to that country as a solution to the problem, and obviously that is not the solution to the problem. It's not working. Whatever we're doing is not working. I don't suspect that the funding will be cut off immediately. I think that what will first happen is that they will continue to give funding with the intention of phasing it out, and any further funding that's sent to Ukraine and sent to that conflict will be done so with much, much stricter conditions. And then it eventually be phased out. What I'm really hoping for Trump and how he addresses the conflict in Ukraine is that he can be the first world leader in the West to actually talk about achieving peace in the region. Because no world leader in the West is talking about that. Even Norway, who has a historic reputation of being the channel that facilitates peace amongst conflicted nations, even here in Norway, there is no talk of peace. And really, in my view and my analysis of that conflict, I don't see any other way out of it than getting both sides at a table like this one, with the fundamental understanding that neither one of them is going to walk out of that room with everything they want. And that's something in the West that we have not been willing to acknowledge. That's the only, and in the meantime, while we're kicking the can down the road and sending endless amounts of American tax dollars and European tax dollars to that conflict, you have an entire generation of young men on both sides being slaughtered. And so I'm anti-war. I really don't care how the war ends, just as long as it ends. And I hope Trump can pioneer the process to make that happen.
Du, Austin, du har dårlig tid og må av gårde. Du har gitt oss en time I dag, så vi veldig stolte og glad for at du gjorde. Du har jo vært I media hele dagen og blir ringt opp hele tiden.
Yes.
Så det noe du føler du burde sagt, som folk bør høre, som vi ikke har vært inne på?
No, I appreciate you having me. This has been a great conversation, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
Og du velkommen tilbake når som helst, selvsagt. Tusen takk, Austin.
Tusen takk.